Good evening. My name is Pete Nelson. I am a teacher at North Country Community College and a co-founder of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. And I'm here in the offices of the Lake George Land Conservancy to talk about place names. I'm happy to be here. I love what these guys do. I followed it for years. And I love talking about this subject. It's fascinating and a little tricky. So let's get right to it. Bear with me while I load up a presentation for you. Okay, so we're off to the races. My email address is on the screen. Feel free to write it down and you can contact me anytime with questions, follow-up, critiques, anything you like. I love hearing from people. Let me first talk a little bit about the background to my slides. The background is a map made by two Mohawk scholars, Karen Hayo Delarond and Jordan Engel. By the way, my pronunciation of names is terrible in any language, so apologies for that. But this map is fascinating, and it's a result of real scholarship. And that's important when you talk about this topic because there's a lot of misinformation. So I chose this map as a background because it has an accurate reflection of the names and the habitation of the Haudenosaunee in this region, fitting for what we're going to talk about. So on we go. So this is fun stuff. It's interesting stuff, but we have to be really careful when we do this. I am not an expert in Adirondack place names. Let's get that out of the way right away. Not that many people are experts in place names in the Adirondacks. I have studied Adirondack history. I lecture on it sometimes for the college, sometimes in other venues. And there's a particular period in the park that fascinates me because I think it's been misrepresented and misunderstood in favor of sort of a mythology. You know, most of the Adirondack history that people are familiar with it's romantic. It talks about the wonders of this wilderness. It's valuable, but it's mythology. And when we follow that mythology, we lose a lot of reality, and that's actually unfortunate. So I'm going to try to correct that a little bit with tonight's talk. It's in the context of work that I'm doing in a book I'm writing to address a more accurate version of the early history, early Euro-American history, I should say, of this park. So this place name work is part and parcel of that. It's complex. So we have to be careful. We have to have some caution when we do this. And I've already said, of course, I'm not an expert in this. We have to embrace uncertainty. We have to embrace uncertainty because there's so much we don't know. There are things that we can guess. There are things that we can talk about, certainly, but we can't be sure of a lot of the history of names. We have to be careful we don't try to own names that aren't ours to own. And that's too easy to do because the winners always win when they name things. I, speaking as a white male, I'm part of a white American culture that, wrote the history in this region. So beware owning names because that's more a reflection on our, taking those names than it is of what they really mean. A lot of mythology, a lot of pseudo scholarship, but we can't have that. So this presentation is not loaded from lots of Wikipedia pages. Here are some of the scholars I relied upon. The first two I already talked about. Dr. Melissa Otis is an expert and well-known in the park in Native American history and studies and culture. Sally Svensson wrote a book about Blacks in the Adirondacks that's highly acclaimed. Phil Terry is the preeminent cultural historian of the Adirondacks. Mary McKenzie was a professional grade historian. She was the historian for North Alba. Her work and her writings, which by the way are wonderful, were important. And along with ownership, we don't want to appropriate names in the history. So we don't want to claim something that really, if we claim it, again, takes away from how complex this tapestry is. Uncertainty is okay. We learn a lot when we're not so certain of things. I teach mathematics, I can tell you that's true. So that's the spirit in which I'm going to proceed. A word about one name in particular. The N word plays a role in the Adirondacks. It plays a big role in names in the Adirondacks. I will not name it. And that's for personal reasons as well as professional reasons. But for personal reasons, myself, with my world and background, that's not a name for me to use. It's inappropriate and it's not necessary. Okay. So if we research Adirondack place names, we reveal a more accurate and inclusive history. And the Adirondack history, as I said, is very much mythology and is certainly not inclusive, not the paradigmatic history most people know. It's really this. And as a privileged white male, I can assure you that this is how history has been written here. Most historical narratives were written from an elite white male transcendental romantic perspective, largely in the 19th century. It's formed all the narratives about wilderness all the way into the 20th century. And it has left out and marginalized people, as I'll show in another slide or say in another slide, you could put in quotes, common people who didn't write the history, but lived it. And it also shorts this region's incredible contribution to American history, something I will talk a little bit about. So privileged visitors did name many places in the Adirondacks, but the people who lived here named many more. And we don't want to leave any of that out. So let me dig in just for a second to what I mean by the fact that this romanticized transcendental vision of wilderness is a fiction. It's lovely, but it's not true. So I'm not going to read these. People who read from the slides that they're presenting should be fired from presenting. Okay, you can read them yourselves. But these are three canonical quotes from writers, historians, visitors to the Adirondacks, and each one of them describes the Adirondacks in the middle of the 19th century as a wilderness, little visited, little explored, the first acts these echoes ever heard, and so on. It's all very poetic, right? It also ain't true. This is a map from the mid-1800s. This is actually a map from 1859. I know it's a little hard for you to see on the screen, but you can hardly call that unexplored. This is a picture of North Elba, Keene, Elizabethtown, so the northern part of Essex County. And you can see that lots, lakes, rivers, many mountain summits are clearly understood. Most of the roads we use today are on this map. This is a very famous map, and I'm not here to talk about maps, but it belies the notion that this was unexplored wilderness. It wasn't. People lived here. People inhabited this place. In fact, they inhabited this place for millennia. So here, just briefly, this is I've sort of laid out, this is the traditional view of Adirondack history, the romantic version. You know, it was a dismal wilderness. You hear that term a lot, which, by the way, since we're talking about place names, the term dismal wilderness was ascribed to a Native American term, and that one is wrong too. But at any rate, it was largely unexplored, right? Then there was some early exploration, really beginning with Ebenezer Emmons in 1836, doing the first scientific survey of the interior, and white explorers traveling to places that never had been seen before, and they start mapping these out. And then finally, Verplanck Colvin comes along in the 1870s and does it at a scale never before done. He was remarkable, right? Coincident with this initial exploration, we have speculation for mining and lumbering, and those develop into industries that have a major impact on the park. There is a wild aesthetic that develops in response to that, written by many of these transcendental romantic writers, and that begins to change the fortunes of the park. There's a struggle that results in the creation of the Adirondack Park and Forever Wild, and on we go. Nice history, fake history. Here's the real history. It looks like this. First of all, most of the Adirondack history you see completely ignores the fact that for 10,000 years, indigenous people lived here. The amount of archaeology in the park has been relatively light for a whole variety of reasons. But as we learn more, we gain more and more evidence that indigenous peoples didn't just pass through. They didn't just come here for a hunting ground. They inhabited the region. arrowheads in Piercefield dating 10,000 years back. In our own Champlain Valley and along Lake George, Paleo-Indian sites dating from the end of the Ice Age as the ice retreated. This was always inhabited. And if we have the idea that a romantic wilderness is unknown to humans, then we've never had one, because it was indeed inhabited. Then we have the period that begins with early Euro-American exploration. Coincidentally, right, 1609 is a very specific year. Henry Hudson comes from the south, Samuel de Champlain comes from the north. Then we have the period that actually I'm interested in my book and won't spend much time on, but there's a period of speculation and settlement, innovation, what I call really the Western frontier at that time. And the Adirondacks was part of that, a major part of that as it happens. And that's a 70 to 90 year period that's completely misunderstood. Sure, there's industry, but there's also culture. There's a major contribution by the Adirondacks to Black civil and voting rights, to Black safety in this country post-slavery and the fight for freedom. There's a major contribution in the Adirondack for women's rights, suffrage, for their freedom. And that, with the green that you see here, is a much more robust and accurate version of what this history is. It's not just wilderness and then we settled it and had a bunch of great places to hike. It's really a much richer story. I won't read this slide, but if you ever hear any of my other lectures, you'll find out about some of these. All of these things that you see are true. The Adirondack contribution to American history is immense, and it's really as important in its time as the Northwest Territories and Manifest Destiny were later. And when we talk about looking at place names, we can bring some of that history back to life because that is an essential record of what happened here. And my lecture tonight on place names won't get into a lot of detail about that because it still needs to be fully rendered. Hasn't been, but all of these things are true. So I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk a little bit about place names in the perspective of Indigenous history, of Black history. Since I'm here in Bolton Landing, I'll talk about Lake George and some environs downstate of where I usually am, which is in Keene. And then for fun, a couple of miscellaneous place names. I imagine many of you will know some of this. Some of you will know much of this, but there'll be some things probably you haven't seen before. There will be cherry picking. Like I said, I'm not the preeminent scholar in this region, so I'm picking and choosing some things that are interesting, and there's a lot more to the story. So the overriding theme with Indigenous place names is that we have replaced reality with fantasy. The reality that we've replaced with fantasy is the result of not really understanding Indigenous place names and the fact that most Native American history is oral tradition, not written. And then white people just appropriated it in one way or another. The details can get kind of interesting, but here's some examples. So first of all, the word Adirondacks. You've heard this debated, I'm sure, and you've heard that it refers to those who eat bark. So far as the Mohawk scholars I talked about before, Ms. Delarande and Jordan Engel, this is true. So it is, Adirondacks is a approximation of a Mohawk word, Ratarontaks, they eat trees. So one that seems reasonably accurate. Then we have Mount Marcy, named after Governor William Leonard Marcy. And it has a Native American name immortalized by Russell Banks in a novel, Tahas, or Cloud Splitter. Well, no, that's fantasy. That was a name appropriated by, or actually, well, it was appropriated by a writer named Charles Fennell Hoffman. It does have a Native American etymology, but it was never applied by any of the Native American nations that frequented the Adirondacks to Mount Marcy. He just decided to do it himself. The closest is the Mohawk to Wawaesta. It pierces. And again, my apologies for what has to be pretty terrible pronunciation. Here's another one. This is one of my favorites because I'm fascinated with early surveying. That is a century before Calvin. And that story is not often told. So in the high peaks, you have Algonquin, Boundary, and Iroquois peaks, which are part of the McIntyre Range. And everybody will tell you that Algonquin and Iroquois go north to south with Boundary in the middle, and it separates the two territories from the Algonquins from the Iroquois. Well, there's so much wrong with this, I don't even know where to start. For one thing, there is no Algonquins. There is an Algonquin language group, and there are many nations that speak a version of that language group. Iroquois is a French name for the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk in particular here in the Adirondack region. And this idea of a boundary between them, that the Algonquinian speaking peoples controlled the northern part of the Adirondacks, and the Mohawk controlled the southern part of the Adirondacks, and the boundary line was right by Boundary Peak, is nonsense. That's just a white invention, total fantasy. First of all, the idea of control is troublesome. The idea of territories being marked out and delineated specifically ain't how it really happened. And I've talked to many Native American scholars who have talked about how the fact that most of these nations, while they would have conflicts and while they would have wars, they also and mostly had cooperation and shared the forest preserve, and not with marked boundaries like that. The reason boundary is called boundary is because a guy named Charles Broadhead surveyed and set a boundary for the Totten Crossfield Purchase on that peak. So another falsehood. Here's one, Whiteface. It's named for the white-hued slides that you see. That's what everybody says. This one's fun because Whiteface is actually the only peak I can think of, the only major peak in the park that honors its Native American name. It's actually taken from First Nations, Wahopatani, which in the Algonquian language means it is white, and it's not from the slides. It's because the makeup of the rock at the summit of Whiteface has a whiter hue. It's not the anorthosite you find elsewhere on the high peaks. And then this one's kind of fun, Sant Noni. Most people think that's a Native American term. No, it's not. It is the way that Abenaki guides pronounced or got close to pronouncing Saint Anthony, who was a patron saint of the French. So this is reversing the other way. Kind of fun. We have to be careful about these names. A lot of complexity in indigenous place names. Ticonderoga, where I teach in the college. That is a Euro-American attempt to say this Mohawk word, and that means it is at the junction of two waterways, which of course Ticonderoga is. And by the way, a terribly romantic thing about that is that junction, that passage between Lake Champlain and Lake George, has a portage and trail that's about 10,000 years old. And to see any remnant of it is to look back in history about as far as you can anywhere in the world. It's enough to make you tear up, really. The Saranac River and the town of Saranac Lake and Upper Saranac and Middle Saranac and Lower Saranac Lakes. Where does the word Saranac come from? No one knows for sure. So there was a scholar of Native American names named J. Donnelly Prince, who was a turn of the 20th century scholar. He really did good work by all accounts. He wrote an initial history of place names in the Adirondacks that wasn't very good. And he realized it wasn't very good. So he went to work and wrote a second one. The second one's still used as reference material. So his version of it is the Abenaki word. The great guide, Mitchell Sabattis, one of the great guides in the history of the park, he described it as a corruption of a different Abenaki word that applied actually to the Plattsburgh area. And of course, the Saranac River empties into Lake Champlain in Plattsburgh. So, as to other names, we could sit here all night, but I can tell you that most of them are faux. They have histories much like Tahaus that Charles Fenno Hoffman coined. They were made up. I have a family member who lives in a little camp called Nodaneo, which is supposed to mean Hill of the Wind. Whether it means anything like that in any Native American language is entirely unclear, but it was created by the generation of white families that lived before he bought it. And there's many, many other examples. So there's a lot more that one can say about Indigenous history, but the theme here is that we have to honor what we can learn from a spotty history, from oral tradition, from what's available to us in Native American languages. And we best begin with the perception that the Euro-American versions of these names are either completely made up or not accurate, or their etymology is very, very unclear. So let's turn to Black history and Adirondack place names, something that has particularly interested me, especially because of my work with the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. So first of all, we don't want to compartmentalize history, and we shouldn't compartmentalize the history of Black people in the Adirondacks any more than we would compartmentalize anybody else's history in the Adirondacks. So it's an early presence. By the late 1700s, there are many hundred slaves and an increasing number of free Black families. There is, and they participate fully in the community, and they participate fully in the exploration of the park, and particularly in the labor to mine, to lumber, and to extract riches from the park. As Black people participated in Adirondack communities, they had a wide variety of experiences and reactions to their presence. And that led to a lot of different place names. So Black place names proliferated, but in a very clear idea about how we have these, how we have problems with class distinctions, and we have overt racism. Almost all the Black place names in the park are not after anybody's name. They are references to skin color, which of course is unique and not a good thing. The history left behind is very incomplete and hard to sort out because white people wrote most of the history. Most names were in response to settlers or laborers, or occasionally, as you'll see at the end of this presentation, people who were doing a work related to social justice, we'll say. And they were almost always pejorative. They were always demeaning and dehumanizing. People who named areas of the Adirondacks because there were Black people there picked some pretty unfriendly names. So all of these, there are dozens of features in the park, some formally named, some informally, with the word Negro, or something like the word Negro will say. Here are 4 of them. And these are still named exactly the way that you see them. Not all were pejorative, which is why you have to be careful. For example, let me do the second one here. There are lots of Black books in the Adirondacks, and I was asked at one point to look into a couple of Black books to understand why they were named what they were. And I by no means did an exhaustive study, but clearly, I don't know, about half of them are pejorative. They were named because of Black settlers who were on or nearby these water courses. And others of them were named simply to describe the darkness of the stream, its depth in the forest, or something else having to do with its physicality. And not all were pejorative in other senses too. The Champlain steamboat story is interesting. This was Tom Molyneux, who was a slave. And this is a well-documented story. He won his freedom because he was a good boxer. He won his freedom in a boxing match in which the stakes were exactly that. And he became celebrated. We're always good, you'll notice, throughout history and certainly today, at lionizing our sports stars. So he was such a good boxer that in 1810, he fought for the world championship in England. So he was something of a celebrity. So he got a steamboat named after him. There are other folks who were busy farming and mining and so on, didn't get that. And then there are things where you have to be careful. Negro Way is a street in Keene Valley, very close to where I live. And it is not related to color. It's not related to race. It's not related to anything like that. It's a family name unrelated to those things, but people have raised their eyebrows at it, understandably. Timbuktu is a name that was given to a settlement in North Elba, but nobody knows very well whether it was ever referred to by that name by the Black families who lived there. So even that, romantic as it is, we have to be a little bit careful of. Speaking of Timbuktu, because it had such an influence on the Adirondacks and on place names, just briefly, Timbuktu was a settlement, one of many actually, in the late 1840s, as a result of a plan by an abolitionist named Garrett Smith, who owned close to 500,000 acres in the Adirondacks. His father was Peter Smith, who was a partner to John Jacob Astor. So he was a very wealthy man. His family obviously had made a fortune in the fur trade, but he was an abolitionist, a strident abolitionist. And he came up with a plan. And the plan was to give away 120,000 acres to free Black families so that they could develop 40-acre plots and increase the value of those plots to at least $250. Why? Because the state of New York had passed a law saying that Black men could vote if and only if they had property worth $250. So this was a plan to establish voting rights, an agrarian ideal community, a safe place, and to build a sense of community with Black people. It was at first heavily promoted. It was a great idea. Not that many families accepted grants. It was hard to have the money to get here, and it was mighty hard to farm here. But communities began to grow. Timbuktu is the one that was near North Elba. There was a wonderful exhibit at the John Brown Farm. And the story of Timbuktu tells you how integrated these Black farmers were into the community, starting a school, a library, church leaders, singers in the choir. That's not a flip comment. Lyman Epps Sr. was renowned for his voice. So Timbuktu is, and there's a wonderful exhibit, as I said. So Timbuktu is an interesting story. Whether the families themselves called it Timbuktu or whether that name comes from a journalist who wrote about the settlement, it's not entirely clear, at least not to me. There was a Blacksville near Loon Lake that was organized by a famed abolitionist at the time named Willis Augustus Hodges. It no longer exists, but the name carried on to other names in the area. Many other locations where this happened. Most of those Black names have faded or been altered, and they should be for the most part, because even in this context, many of the names that grew up around this effort were pejorative, racist, negative. Okay, and I'll actually have a little more to say about that in a second. I thought I'd talk a little bit about Lake George and Champlain, since I'm looking out the window at Lake George right now. So it's fascinating, of course, because there's no place in the North Country that has a more important set of layers dealing with the history of this continent. So as I said before, we're talking about more than 10,000 and really more than 11,000 in the Champlain Valley years of continuous human occupation. These indigenous populations, most of those names are long lost or have been distorted. For example, the Mohawk name for Lake George was Adirondack. And when James Fenimore Cooper wrote Last of the Mohicans, which had a lot of nice inventions in it, he used the word Horicon for Lake George. And that was an invention because he felt that the Mohawk name was too hard to pronounce. So the Mohawk name is gone. We have this idea that Horicon was a traditional name. And then of course it was named Lake George by Sir William Johnson in the middle of the French Indian War. So the French exploration that preceded the British control of the area named a lot of features of Lake Champlain. The French explored the length and breadth of Lake Champlain and had extremely accurate maps and place names for every feature you can think of. Lake George, not so much. They did venture that far, the Jesuits did, that far south. So as I'm sure most of you know, it was Lac du Saint-Sacrement, named by Isaac Jogues. Most of the other features around Lake George, there's no, there are few recorded French names that I've been able to find. There was the British occupation, ultimate conquest and victory in the French Indian War. So everything's named with British names. They get the naming spoils. The most interesting example of all of those names is this map. It's a very famous map. It's a military map that was created for Sir Geoffrey Amherst. And it shows the environment of Lake Champlain. And then in the inset, it shows the environment of Lake George. This map is actually available online. You can see details. It was a draftsman named William Brassier, who was King George's official draftsman. That's really an amazing map. Also, you can find online and a YouTube video describing it, a really interesting map, which is, and this is just an inset, it's basically the same map. This is a piece of it. Actually, the inset is not Lake George, but the Lake Champlain part is all of the French names meticulously researched by Joseph Andre Senecal, who's at the University of Vermont. It was a huge project that he did. So those two maps give you a real good idea of the range of place names here in the Lake George and Champlain Valley region. This slide is important. It's fun to talk about place names. It can be eye-opening. It can be provocative, but this isn't just about history. All of these place names, the ones that have made it to the modern day and the ones that haven't, the ones that are negative and pejorative and oppressive, and the ones that are mythology, all of them form this tapestry of our history. But they also inform all too often, sometimes in great ways and sometimes in bad ways, the present. So I want to show how your region is still important in this story. There is a project going on right now that I learned about through the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. It is a project to name something Fitch Hill, and it's not very far away. It's in Corinth, inside the park. And I want to give all credit to the two people who are working on it. They have a formal proposal to the U.S. Board of Geographic Names, Rebecca Wasserman and David Rihimaki. And their work is what I'm presenting here. So there's a summit, and it was originally recorded by the U.S. Board of Geographic Names as the N-word hill. It's a hill inside the Adirondacks in Corinth. In 1960, or first of all, why the name? It was pejorative, obviously, and it was assigned because there was a Black family that ran an Underground Railroad stop there. Also were involved in a variety of ways in helping other Black families. But the Underground Railroad stop is the sort of the feature by which we might want to honor them more than anything else. So in 1963, this is something that many people may not know, but the U.S. Board of Geographic Names is a federal institution underneath the U.S. Geological Survey. In 1963, the Secretary of the Department of Interior required all names that had the N-word to be replaced with the word Negro. So N Hill became Negro Hill, which it is to this day. But obviously that's still racist. So Ms. Wasserman and Mr. Rihimaki have put a proposal to the U.S. Geological Survey that would rename the feature Fitch Hill. To get something renamed, I've actually done that myself. Takes a lot of documentation, a great deal of patience, and it's an important effort. They would rename the feature Fitch Hill to honor the very family who ran this Underground Railroad stop, who risked their lives, and who were integral to the community and to social justice, to celebrate the very thing that we denigrate with the name that it's still called. So place names in history are still place names in the present. And it's in my mind, a moral responsibility to address these pejorative names and to do better. And in so doing, move mythology away and replace it with a more inclusive and more real history. I'll finish with a couple of miscellaneous place names just for fun. Many of you may know all of these or some of these, but it's still kind of fun. The Adirondacks are full of just amazing place names. So Adirondack Lodge, right? If you want to hike in the high peaks, if you can find parking, you can go to the Adirondack Lodge area run by the Adirondack Mountain Club, and it's spelled L-O-J. Why is it spelled L-O-J? Because Melvin Dewey, creator of the Dewey Decimal System, didn't like words that used phonetics with too many letters. Why have the D, G, and E? We used to have a darn J. So he wanted it Adirondack Lodge, and being a man of great influence, one of the founders of the Lake Placid Club, he was able to have Adirondack Lodge renamed, if you will. Melvin Dewey was no saint when it comes to place names and racism and prejudice, but he won on the name battle. Calamity Pond is a marvelous spot. If you're hiking through the high peaks in the south, you'll come upon it, and when you do, you'll come upon a monument to David Henderson that was erected in 1845, which is when he was accidentally shot and lost his life there. What had been called Deck Hole has ever since been called Calamity Pond. Esther Mountain is one of the high peaks. It's often climbed with whiteface, so named because a 15-year-old young lady named Esther McComb went to climb whiteface even though she was told not to. And there was no trail, but she was going to do it, and she ended up climbing the wrong summit. She was found and rescued, and she was just fine. And so fine was she that they said, you know what? You found that thing, we're going to name it. So it's still there. It is one of only 2 high peaks in the Adirondacks named after a woman. The second one, Grace Peak, was renamed recently to honor Grace Udalowski, who's one of the original Adirondack 46ers. That's 2 out of 46 that go to women. But of course, our culture is already so terribly inclusive. Lake Bonaparte, just west of the Adirondack. What's that named after? Yep, it's named after Napoleon, because his brother Joseph bought, I think, 40,000 acres west of the Adirondacks to make a new France, to which his brother Napoleon Bonaparte could escape the ravages of his failed revolution. And Napoleon never got here, but the lake's still there. North Elba, which is where Lake Placid is, was named Elba. And it was named Elba because the island of Elba, which coincidentally Napoleon was exiled to for a time, was famed for its mineral riches. And the early prospectors who came to the Adirondacks to mine were very hopeful that where they were mining would be just as good as Elba. So they named it Elba. Unfortunately, when they named it Elba in the early 1800s, 1806, I think it was, 1807, something like that, they learned a couple years later that there was already an Elba in New York. So they had to name it North Elba, and that stuck. Peru, same story. There's a Peru in New York because the Adirondack Mountains were referred to by many speculators as the Peru Mountains, hoping that, like the mountains in Peru, legendary for gold and silver, the Adirondacks would reveal similar riches and everybody would be wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice. And last but not least, Racket Lake is, and no one knows exactly if this is true, but is so named because Sir John Johnson and his Tory allies, fleeing Americans hell-bent to catch them during the Revolutionary War, followed one of the ancient Native American trails that connected Mohawk territory with Abenaki territory and Canada. And it went by Racket Lake. When they started their escape, there was a lot of snow, so they used snowshoes. By the time they got to Racket Lake, the snow had melted so much they couldn't use snowshoes anymore. So they abandoned them in a stack. The French word for snowshoe is racket. So the story of place names is far more than I can give you in the little amount of time that I've been able to share with you tonight, but it is a fascinating story, and it echoes throughout history, but it has lessons for us and missions for us even today. I thank you for your time, and I now welcome your questions.